Right, we're coming back to St. John's Gospel after Christmas and Luke and everything else. John 3:22. After this, Jesus and his disciples went to the province of Judea, where he spent some time with them and baptized. John also was baptizing in Aenon, not far from Salem, because there was plenty of water in that place. People were going to him, and he was baptizing them. This was before John had been put in prison. I think that's a fairly obvious point, really. Some of John's disciples began arguing with a Jew about the matter of ritual washing. So he went to John and said, "Teacher, you remember the man who was with you on the east side of the Jordan, the one you spoke about? Well, he is baptizing now, and everyone is going to him." John answered, "No one can have anything unless God gives it to him. You yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Messiah, but I have been sent ahead of him. The bridegroom is the one to whom the bride belongs, but the bridegroom's friend, who stands by and listens, is glad when he hears the bridegroom's voice. This is how my own happiness is made complete. He must become more important, while I become less important." I think these first chapters of John's Gospel, where we are quite literally, what you might say, on the cusp of Jesus' ministry, when we are about to have, if you like, the great spiritual breakthrough in the history of the world, where Jesus comes to break the power of evil and to change the whole dynamic of the universe so that we can be saved, where we have this enormous sense of the kingdom breaking in and the truth being preached. I want to share with you this very basic thought that I read as I read this week, of what in some ways looks like an in-between passage in St. John's Gospel. What is that Jesus is doing, and what is John the Baptist doing at this crucial time? They are in the water baptizing people. And I just want you to dwell on that picture, a very physical picture of water and mud and wet men and lots of muscle and jostling and people trying to get into the water and get out of the water, and Jesus and John in various places stripped to the waist with the help of their disciples, getting all these people in and getting them out again, and the noise that you would have in a Middle Eastern occasion and what have you. This is what is happening at this crucial moment in the spiritual history of the world. Yes, there has been preaching. Yes, there has been proclamation. Yes, there has been the word. But actually, the basic response is not lots of people signing anything or saying the creed or saying what they believe. It is lots and lots of people getting wet. It is not simply that Jesus is making important, profound intellectual points, but that Jesus is standing in this water dunking people. Unless you can get hold of the basic physicality of this, the whole sort of earthiness of it, I think you miss it. The word becomes flesh is not just the sort of thing that happens at Christmas. But the incarnate God in Christ is flesh. And the kingdom is flesh. And the Spirit dwells in the flesh. And all this mud and water and muscle and men and wetness. This is crucial to this. And although we don't quite know what the baptism of Jesus was at the time, we know it would have been for repentance. It would also have been as a sign of the coming of the kingdom. This was not proselyte baptism. This was not sort of just that. It was far more than that. They wouldn't have been baptized unless they thought the Messiah was coming. And we know that in the early church, from when we know by the time St. Paul was converted, the first thing he did was he was baptized. And baptism becomes the initiation into Christ, the initiation into the church. You get this in Romans, since we have been baptized into Christ. So baptism is crucial, and it's wet. And yet, we who are sons and daughters of the Greeks have so intellectualized our faith that we talk about the truth, we talk about the gospel, we talk about the word, but the word stays word. And certainly in the Methodist Church, we have not been good at doing this sort of baptism. We've been fairly good at doing christenings of babies, but that's fine, but it's not this. It's more of a covenant relationship and welcoming to the family. It's got nothing to do with repentance, and it's got nothing to do with regeneration. I think sometimes people see the impact in the world of Christianity on the edges, where we go and do things and visit the sick and look after people and care for people and give to this and do that. And they can see something. But when they come into the core of our worship, it is basically intellectual. Christianity looks to them like a balloon. You can see the balloon, but inside it, what's supposed to be making it work looks like emptiness. It's a mystery. And they will say, well, what's going on? I can't see. It's all inside your head. I'll tell you one thing. In those early days, you could have seen something going on with all that baptism. What's going on? They're all getting wet. I think we perhaps need to rethink this. How is it that we miss these passages and the passages in the Acts and the early church? Be converted, be saved, be forgiven, be renewed, be restored, be a new man and woman. Yes. Brackets, but we won't mention being baptized. I think perhaps we need to rethink the whole physicality of a God who comes in his spirit incarnate into the whole world. Perhaps we need, how many of you, don't put your hands up. It's dangerous in this sort of congregation, but some of you will have been baptized. And so for one reason or another, some of you will have not been baptized. I was christened. But I've been involved in lots of adult baptisms, and they've been some of the best occasions for the person and for the church and for me that we ever had. And it was very wet, and it was very messy, but it was very tangible. This tangibility, Jesus says, doesn't he? We'll share in some of the Last Supper in a few moments. Jesus says, on that very tough night, just before it all goes badly wrong, and the disciples need to hold together, he doesn't say, brethren, we are going to have a really hard time. I want you to say after me, and produces some kind of creed. And they all need to say and believe. He says, let's eat. Here's bread and here's wine. Here's something to do. Here's something to drink. Here's something to chew up. It is physical. And in worship, I probably told you before, but I gather that every time in Hebrew worship is referenced in the Old Testament, it is not abstract. It is always to describe a function of the body. I bow my head. I lift my hands. I prostrate myself. I bow the knee. Everything. I lift my eyes. It's not, as the Greek would say, I sat there in an otherworldly way and thought hard. Because for the Hebrew there's a holistic view. It's a bit like a spiritual way of the hokey-cokey. A terrible thing. I always need to go out during that in a party. But after we've done the hand and the head and the bits and the pieces, you get to the worst verse, don't you? You put your whole self in and your whole self out. Oh, dear. I would like to sit on the edge and say, I'm not moving, but I'm putting my whole spirit in and my whole spirit out. And some ways our sort of Protestant spirituality is, I'm not moving, but I'm putting my whole spirit in. For the Jew, I put my whole self in, body, mind and spirit. You can't put anything between them. There's that putting together. And this is, when you think about all these wet, muddy men, it's a great advantage if we can revisit this as it was for those men. It gave them quite literally something to do rather than just something to think. There's a tangible response. And with the crowd all standing around and looking and criticizing and making comments, you knew who was with Jesus. You didn't have to guess. They were the ones that went into the water. There is a testimony here, a definiteness. Nobody said, so have you been baptized or not? Well, I'm not sure. You know whether you've been baptized or not. Have you given your life to Jesus? Well, I'm not sure. Well, that's slightly different. And so there's a great sense of being able to respond to things. And the water is part of it. It's not an illustration. It's not a metaphor. It's not an analogy. It is it. One of the great things that we stumbled across here in our receiving communion, which we will do in a few moments, is that everybody comes out and sort of forms a rather ragged queue to receive the communion. Everybody moves. Everybody comes together. If I was to say to you, well, of course we've got to queue up, the way you queue up at McDonald's, you just got to queue up until you get your bit. It ignores the moving sense of it, the self-giving, the arriving. It's not just waiting to take it. It is bringing yourself. I think so. And that sense of it being real. Which is why it's quite good in our worship. You want to raise your hands if you like. One of the great things of having a projector, isn't it? You can raise your hands without lots of books in them. You say, well, that's you don't have to do it. But it's you. It comes in a certain way. Is it not significant? I mean, I've been to one or two, and many of you have been to more than that, great rallies of Billy Graham. When Billy Graham has preached the gospel splendidly, as he always does he say, now I want you to give your life to Jesus? Does he say that? No, he doesn't. He says, I'm going to ask you to get up out of your seat. What's that about? Why can't you do it in your seat? I thought that at Wembley. But you are giving yourself. There is that physicality. I think we need that. But not only that, God is committed to this. Not only is John the Baptist in the water, but a few miles away, Jesus is in the water. And then he has to bring his disciples in. By the next chapter in John, he's delegating to his disciples. There's too many people. But Jesus, I like to just think of Jesus stripped to the waist in the water, dealing with all these people. In other words, God throws himself into this. God is not just on the edge, sort of saying, I've got a good idea. You think if God throws himself into this, is totally committed. It's what God does. And Jesus says at the communion, doesn't he? He doesn't say, I've got some bread here, I've got some wine here. It's a good symbol of what's going to happen. This is my body, this is my blood. I'm throwing myself into this. I'm going to die on the cross. It's me, I put my whole self in. At the end of the day, the crucifixion, the blood, sweat, tears and wood, is completely tied up with the cross and the atonement. You can't do one without the other. It's not a spiritual crucifixion. It's a total crucifixion. He knows that. God throws himself into this. I think that when I've occasionally done adult baptisms, man, where is Jesus? He's in the water with the person. I'm out here with the towels, but he's in there with the water, you know? That God commits it. And so the two things come together. And I would just, I don't want to labour this, but just want to sort of think through with you. As soon as we begin to get the water, then the actual physicality of it, the actual practicality of it, becomes a factor in it. This is not sort of an illustration of family service. This is tangible and real. I thought this is an amazing verse here, apart from that verse that does remind us that John doing this can't have been in prison, which I think is great. It says, John was baptizing because there was plenty of water in this place. That's a great bit of verse, isn't it? Now, clearly in the normal wilderness, you don't do baptisms because it's lots of sand dunes, but because there was lots of water, that was a factor in it. There's John and the men and the Spirit and the water. There's an intangible way that this is happening. Doesn't this remind you of the Ethiopian eunuch, where Philip has gone and preached to him, and he's convicted in his soul, and he knows the gospel, but what does he say then? He says, oh, here's some water. What is to stop me from being baptized? That's not a spiritual question. That's a physical question. We've got the water now. You can imagine the Ethiopian eunuch saying, oh, from here on there's 500 miles of sand dunes. What chance have I got of being baptized? It begins to involve itself. We seem to get opportunities. One of the reasons that why Methodist churches on the whole are bad at doing baptisms is they don't have tanks. Not like Baptist churches, that have sort of things underneath the floor and all that. Oh, we can't do that, we haven't got a tank. I tell you, if you start thinking water, you can do tanks. You start thinking in that sense. We were in Cyprus. We don't have a tank, but we had a 50-metre Olympic swimming pool. We hired it. It works. When I was in South Devon, somebody wanted to be baptised. They knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who was very rich. And we went round to their house, to their private covered swimming pool. You take the opportunity, the water's getting involved. You see what I mean? I used to, in Nottingham, we bought a paddling pool that we blew up. Quite literally at one point, but we inflated it anyway and filled it with sort of fairly lukewarm water. And there's water on the carpet. But it was so good. You just go for the opportunity, don't you? I had one lady in Devon who was quite literally phobic about this, and there's no way she can go in. No way. So we got a massive great ground sheet, and I poured a bucket of water over her. I got wetter than she did, but it was, you just take the opportunities, don't you? The water is getting involved. I think so. Sometimes I will go and visit somebody who's housebound and they say, I would love you to bring in house communion to me sometimes. And I say, yeah, we'll sort that out. And I go away again. I thought, yesterday afternoon, having a run round, I thought, why don't I say, have you got any bread? Have you got any ribena? Or even better, have you got any wine? And do it. As the opportunity comes, as the physical opportunity comes. Remember one famous occasion on a camp when we were having a time of prayer, and it was a thunderstorm. Rather than running indoors, oh, I'm getting wet. Take your hat off and let it pour all over you, and let's pray. Wow. Is that an illustration or a metaphor? It is not. It is God chipping in with the water. And just one final reference to Billy Graham. I took a whole coachload of people when we were in London to Wembley for Mission to London when he was speaking. And it was a horrendous night. There was thunderstorms. And when he got to the big bit, I'm going to ask you to get out of your seat, the heavens opened. It was absolutely threw it down. There was thunder. There was fork lightning. It's the old Wembley, this is it. Hit the edge of the stand. There was an amazing flash. All the floodlights went out. All the sound system went out. And as it sort of came on, all these people got out and went out into about 2 inches of water on the pitch. It was awesome. Who is going to say, oh, I thought it was going to major spiritual experience, real possibility of some progress there, and you won't believe it, it was a thunderstorm, it wrecked the whole thing. The thunderstorm was the thing. God is saying, who runs this place then? We need to start looking at the physical a bit more. And they were all there baptizing people, getting wet. And when that happens, in a way, Christianity is a footprint in our lives, in the life of the church, and in the life of the world. And we make waves, quite literally. And of course, there's some aggro about this. And the disciples of John saying, there's a lot more disciples going to Jesus. Because when things start to happen, not just are believed, but they take up space and they rub into one another. And there's a bit if John the Baptist had been preaching a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and Jesus has been preaching a little bit of this and a little bit of that, well, it's okay. But when we get to baptism, you can count the people. There's a territory here, isn't there? There's a turf war going on here. It's starting to bump into one another. If I went round Penzance and so on, I have a few theological discussions. So I have a few coffee houses, I'm going to a few coffee shops and talk with a few people about, interesting things like predestination, post-millennialism, and that kind of thing. We might think, that's important. But I tell you what, there will be no aggro about it. But if I decide I have a firm view of something, I'm going to start a church, a new church. What's going on? Who's going to go there? Who's going to leave us? Where does this fit in? As soon as you've got something on the road, you get angst. We're just getting to the end of that week of prayer for Christian unity sort of period. We do not, on the whole, have problems with other Christians because we have differences in doctrine. A few, yes, perhaps more than we could if we thought about it. But no, it's because how it happens. It's the footprint. It's whether you're christening babies or adults, or how you dress up, or whether you do this or that or that or that. Because it's what you do, it's the physical side of it that causes the trouble. And we make waves, quite literally, in the world and in our lives, not just by, I thought this thought. And John says, the way to deal with this, he says, is to work out who you are and who Jesus is. And he says, look, I've got to become less. Jesus has got to become more. I'm like the best man. I make a big speech. I run around and organise things, but it's all about him. And it's not just a humility thing. Well, I think this is the new man taking over from me. He says in the the verses that follow, because he's come down from heaven and I'm earthbound, which is underselling himself really, because we read he was filled with the Spirit. But he says he comes down from heaven. And then when you've got it coming down from heaven and we believe in Jesus, I don't care. I need to listen to Jesus, not count how many people are being baptized. We need in our own church, in our own lives, to say, we believe in Jesus in the centre. We believe in the Spirit who falls on us. And we're just not going on and on and on about who's going where and what's happening and this and this and this. And if the Spirit is descending on this, not only does this sort this out in a gracious way, not only does it mean that there's kind of friction and angst and a bit of bumping up and down, which is good when things are happening. If nothing's happening, nobody falls out. If that is sanctified, if the sort of mixed economy works, not only is it the Spirit helps us to avoid just having habits and having traditions and going through the motions. I came to communion, I must be all right. No. The church runs lots of services, that's fine. Yeah? No. I go to prayer meetings. No. It's okay, but it's not it. It's when the Spirit comes and the Word becomes flesh. Without the Word, we've just got flesh. We've just got tokenism. We've just got doing things and putting a tick in the box. Did you come to communion? Oh, yes, I came to communion. Did you queue up? Yes, I queued up. But if the Spirit comes, then all of this has life. Without the Spirit, you've just got a thunderstorm. Without the Spirit, you've just got a bit of bread and ribena. Without the Spirit, you've just got a bit of dry, well, I agree with this kind of thing. So this morning, let's just hold in our minds. When you're holding in your minds, you come to communion, something very different to communion. All those wet, muddy men. And Jesus there in the midst. And the kingdom coming. And say, Lord, I don't want to stand on the bank and say, I'm putting my whole spirit in. I get out the bank and put my whole self in.